Okay, then I will arrest you for obstruction.
You do that, buddy, and I'll sue the out of Adams County.
Step out.
Got it.
Step out.
You better get a. I want a sergeant here.
Step out.
I want a sergeant here.
Step out, and you're gonna get tased.
Get tased.
Right to film cops is not conditional upon police approval. It does not require a permit. It does not expire because
From the very first seconds of this encounter, one can perceive a tension that is both immediate and persistent. The auditor positions himself in a public area, fully aware of the rights afforded by the Constitution, and yet, from the transcript, it becomes evident how quickly a routine interaction can pivot into an assertion of authority versus the defense of civil liberties. The interaction opens a window into the fragile balance between citizen rights and law enforcement prerogatives, a dynamic that, on the surface, appears simple but in practice reveals complex power structures. The auditor's presence and calm demeanor contrast sharply with the officer's escalating posture, providing a real-time study of how authority perceives and reacts to scrutiny. The initial phase is deceptively mundane. The auditor is engaging in what appears to be an observational act, recording in a public space, standing lawfully, and speaking in measured tones. Yet, as the transcript makes clear, this simple act of recording becomes the catalyst for the unfolding tension. The officer's immediate response is one of assertive procedural demand, requests for identification, license, and registration. These requests, standard in traffic enforcement, are here placed under scrutiny because the auditor operates from a position of informed legal awareness. This juxtaposition, the procedural norm of law enforcement against a citizen's deliberate testing of constitutional boundaries, sets the stage for the escalation that follows. Within moments, the transcript documents repeated demands for compliance coupled with threats of physical coercion. The officer commands the auditor to step out, threatens taser deployment, and insists on production of identification, all while the auditor remains lawfully positioned. This sequence demonstrates a psychological phenomenon frequently observed in bodycam encounters. Officers' perception of control is immediately challenged by non-compliance that is entirely lawful, prompting a defensive and increasingly forceful response. Each command and threat is not only a procedural tool, but also a projection of authority meant to intimidate. The transcript captures the layered dynamics of escalation, revealing how quickly ordinary interactions can intensify when authority is questioned. The auditor's strategic calm becomes a focal point in this opening phase, standing without obstructing or causing a disturbance and requesting identification of the officers before complying. The auditor forces the officers to confront the legal limits of their authority. This is not defiance in the colloquial sense, but a deliberate exercise of constitutional knowledge. The transcript repeatedly emphasizes the officer's reactions to these assertions: insistence, repetition, and threats. These responses reveal the officer's reliance on habitual assertion of control rather than measured adherence to legal standards. This moment crystallizes a critical lesson. Lawful assertion of rights often provokes institutional tension, not because of illegality, but because of the challenge it presents to perceived authority. Legal context, as outlined in the transcript, underscores the gravity of these interactions. References to the Fourth Amendment, the Supreme Court, and established case law frame the encounter not merely as a confrontation, but as a microcosm of civil rights enforcement. The transcript illustrates that public recording is constitutionally protected and cannot, under any established law, constitute obstruction or probable cause for arrest. Yet, the officers repeatedly threaten arrest for obstruction, demonstrating a disconnect between procedural knowledge and on-the-ground enforcement. Here, the transcript provides insight into systemic vulnerabilities. The misalignment between officer perception and legal reality can generate unnecessary escalation, endanger citizens' rights, and create liability for the agency. Throughout the transcript, repetition becomes a key mechanism of escalation. Commands to produce ID, repeated threats to detain or use force, and insistence on supervisory involvement create a cumulative psychological effect. Each repetition intensifies the tension, revealing how minor procedural disagreements can compound into significant confrontations. The transcript meticulously captures these exchanges, providing an opportunity for analysis of both officer behavior and citizen response. The auditor's calm persistence functions as a stabilizing counterpoint to the officer's heightened aggression, demonstrating how knowledge and patience can influence the trajectory of high-stakes encounters. The transcript also documents the officer's reliance on perceived authority rather than objective legal standards. When the auditor refuses to provide identification without reciprocal disclosure, the officers escalate, claiming obstruction and threatening taser use. This is a textbook example of authority enforcement through intimidation rather than compliance with law. The transcript shows that the auditor remains fully within legal rights, highlighting how quickly misperception of intent can shift routine encounters into potential civil rights violations. Observers can see step by step how an ordinary citizen's lawful exercise of rights triggers repeated attempts at control, illustrating the fragility of constitutional protections in the absence of informed resistance. Another significant element revealed in the transcript is the auditor's use of requests for a sergeant as a strategic tool. This repeated invocation of supervisory presence introduces a structural checkpoint, forcing the officers to consider oversight and procedural accountability. Each refusal or delay intensifies tension, demonstrating how hierarchies within law enforcement can amplify conflict when individual officers perceive challenges to their authority. The transcript documents these moments precisely, offering a real-time study of how escalation mechanics operate in practice. The interplay between citizen rights, procedural knowledge, and institutional hierarchy becomes central to understanding the dynamics of bodycam encounters. The transcript further emphasizes the psychological interplay between perceived defiance and institutional response. Officers interpret lawful recording as challenge or disrespect, a cognitive misinterpretation that leads to repeated threats, verbal pressure, and insistence on compliance. The auditor, by maintaining calm and consistent behavior, exposes the performative aspect of authority. It is enacted and asserted not solely through legal channels, but through intimidation, repetition, and dominance. This creates an instructive tension within the footage, highlighting the thin line between lawful enforcement and personal assertion of power. Particularly noteworthy in this first phase is the way the transcript situates the encounter within the broader framework of rights and accountability. References to the Supreme Court and federal case law, alongside specific analysis of obstruction and reasonable suspicion, provide a legal backbone to the narrative. Observers can see that the officers' repeated threats are not supported by law, they are procedural overreach enacted in real time. This juxtaposition, calm, lawful assertion against reactive, lawless assertion, forms the core of Part 1's analysis, providing insight into the mechanics of civil rights confrontations in everyday law enforcement. The transcript also highlights the role of documentation in preserving accountability. By recording the interaction, the auditor creates a permanent record that captures every verbal command, every threat, and every misstep. This documentation transforms subjective perception into verifiable evidence. It ensures that subsequent analysis, whether legal, procedural, or scholarly, can accurately reflect what occurred. The transcript demonstrates that without this recording, these subtle but significant violations might have gone unnoticed or been rationalized away. Independent documentation thus becomes a critical safeguard in the preservation of civil liberties. As the initial encounter unfolds, the transcript also demonstrates the cumulative effect of repeated procedural violations. Each demand, each verbal escalation, and each threat compounds tension and creates a chain reaction. The auditor's consistent calm presence functions as a stabilizing counterweight, yet the officer's insistence on asserting dominance repeatedly tests the boundaries of lawful conduct. Observers can track, moment by moment, how small actions and misinterpretations cascade into significant legal and psychological stakes. Finally, we establishes a narrative foundation for understanding the broader dynamics at play. The transcript illustrates that even seemingly minor interactions, requests for ID, standing in public, filming can evolve into substantial confrontations when officers misinterpret lawful behavior as defiance. The detailed sequence of escalation, threats, and repeated demands captured in the transcript provides a clear example of how authority, when unchecked or misapplied, can create both immediate risk and long-term systemic consequences. It is a testament to the importance of constitutional knowledge, strategic calm, and independent observation in protecting civil liberties. The transcript reveals not just an individual encounter, but a case study in institutional behavior. It shows the delicate balance between lawful enforcement and overreach, highlighting how minor procedural missteps can quickly escalate into constitutional violations. Through meticulous documentation of every escalation point, the transcript provides a roadmap for understanding the psychological, legal, and structural dynamics of law enforcement interactions. In this opening phase, the audience witnesses the unfolding tension in real time, setting the stage for deeper analysis of legal implications, civil rights challenges, and the systemic importance of accountability. As the encounter continues, the tension between authority and accountability intensifies, revealing patterns that are as procedural as they are psychological. In the transcript, the auditor's consistent calm and measured responses contrast sharply with the officer's escalating posturing. This section of the encounter transitions from an initial testing of rights to a prolonged examination of institutional behavior under scrutiny. Every command, every threat, and every insistence on compliance demonstrates how officers respond when lawful assertion of rights challenges their perception of control. Here, the transcript provides a detailed roadmap for understanding escalation mechanics, legal boundaries, and the subtle ways in which authority can transform routine encounters into constitutional crises. The officers repeatedly demand identification, license, and registration from the auditor, despite the absence of any reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. Legally, the transcript underscores that under the Fourth Amendment, such demands are permissible only when there is a lawful detention predicated on specific, articulable facts suggesting criminal behavior. The auditor, standing lawfully in public and recording the interaction, presents no such facts. This misalignment between legal standards and officer behavior exemplifies a recurring theme in Bodycam encounters: the divergence between discretionary authority and constitutional compliance. Each repeated demand not only escalates tension, but also provides a clear example of procedural overreach that can be dissected, analyzed, and if necessary, legally challenged. Throughout the transcript, threats escalate from verbal commands to implied physical coercion. The officer's repeated assertion of potential arrest for obstruction alongside threats to deploy a taser illustrate the psychological leverage that authority wields over citizens. In practical terms, these threats create a coercive environment designed to elicit compliance regardless of legality. Yet the auditor, by maintaining composure and insisting on supervisor involvement, exposes the limits of such authority. This portion of the transcript demonstrates the importance of procedural knowledge. The auditor's understanding of legal rights functions as a buffer against intimidation, transforming what might otherwise be a high-risk encounter into a controlled assertion of civil liberties. The repeated requests for a sergeant, documented in the transcript, serve as a structural counterbalance to escalating authority. Each invocation introduces an external checkpoint within the hierarchical framework of law enforcement. Officers, confronted with the auditor's insistence on oversight, exhibit both resistance and frustration, revealing a tendency to rely on positional power rather than legal justification. This dynamic is instructive. The transcript captures how hierarchies can either mitigate or exacerbate conflict depending on how officers interpret and respond to supervisory presence. The repeated calls for a sergeant are not mere procedural formalities. They are strategic interventions that expose the officer's reliance on perceived autonomy in decision-making and the corresponding risk of constitutional violations. One of the transcript's most revealing aspects in this segment is the officer's interpretation of obstruction. Despite the auditor engaging in no physical interference or illegal activity, obstruction is repeatedly invoked as a potential justification for arrest. Legal doctrine, as the transcript notes, distinguishes between active interference and lawful recording. The officer's repeated threats reveal a pattern of using subjective perception of non-compliance as a pretext for coercion. This is a fundamental lesson in analyzing bodycam footage. Misinterpretation of lawful behavior can escalate interactions, creating liability for both officers and their agencies. Observers can clearly see how the auditor's steadfast adherence to law challenges entrenched assumptions about authority and compliance, turning ordinary procedural interactions into high-stakes tests of constitutional fidelity. The transcript also illustrates how repetition and verbal insistence amplify psychological pressure. Each command to produce identification, each insistence on stepping out, and each verbal threat compounds the stress of the interaction. The auditor's calm, consistent responses act as a stabilizing counterforce, highlighting a central principle in citizen rights enforcement. Knowledge and patience can shape outcomes even in high-tension encounters. Here, the transcript provides a step-by-step account of escalation mechanics, showing that cumulative verbal pressure often drives confrontations more than isolated, Commands. Observers can track how these repeated interactions magnify the risk of misinterpretation, both in real time and retrospectively when evaluating compliance with legal standards. A particularly instructive feature of the transcript is how it situates the encounter within broader legal context. References to Supreme Court precedent, federal case law, and clearly established rights provide a framework for analyzing officer behavior. Public recording is affirmed repeatedly as a constitutionally protected activity, yet officers attempt to construe it as obstruction. The transcript captures the clash between legal clarity and on-the-ground perception of authority, illustrating a recurrent vulnerability in law enforcement practice. When officers rely on intuition or assumed control rather than legal thresholds, encounters escalate unnecessarily. This portion of the transcript demonstrates how education, legal literacy, and strategic assertion of rights can prevent or mitigate abuse of authority. The transcript also emphasizes the psychological dimension of these interactions. Officers interpret lawful recording as provocation, and their repeated threats are less responses to risk than attempts to reclaim perceived dominance. This performative element of authority is central to understanding escalation dynamics. It is not only what is done that matters, but how it is perceived. The auditor's measured persistence exposes these behavioral patterns, revealing the delicate interplay between ego, institutional expectation, and lawful enforcement. Observers can study these moments to better understand how calm, informed assertion of rights disrupts ingrained patterns of coercion and intimidation. Documentation emerges as a central theme in Part 2. The auditor's continuous recording ensures that each instance of overreach, each misapplied command, and each escalation point is preserved. This permanence transforms the encounter from a subjective disagreement into an objective evidentiary record. The transcript underscores that without this documentation, subtle violations could remain unexamined, rationalized, or ignored. Independent observation, as shown here, functions as both a protective mechanism for citizens and a tool for institutional accountability. The auditor's role is pivotal. By creating a transparent record, they enable subsequent analysis, legal action, and systemic scrutiny. Another key aspect highlighted in the transcript is the officer's reliance on perceived control rather than procedural justification. Commands escalate, threats are repeated, and obstruction is claimed without legal basis. The transcript illustrates that officers' authority is enacted performatively through intimidation, verbal repetition, and physical threat rather than justified by law. The auditor's consistent, calm, lawful behavior counters this dynamic, creating a clear contrast between procedural compliance and subjective assertion of power. Observers can trace this interaction step by step, gaining insight into how authority functions in practice and how legal literacy can protect rights even in high-stakes encounters. The transcript also sheds light on the interplay between law, hierarchy, and supervision. By repeatedly requesting a sergeant, the auditor introduces oversight into the situation, compelling officers to confront accountability structures. This strategic move illustrates how citizens can navigate hierarchical systems to ensure adherence to rights. Each refusal or delay in compliance by the officers amplifies tension, highlighting the fragility of authority structures when challenged. Observers can study these sequences to understand how escalation is influenced not only by individual officers, but by organizational culture and the mechanisms of oversight. The transcript further demonstrates how minor procedural violations can compound into larger systemic issues. Repeated threats, insistence on identification without legal justification, and misinterpretation of lawful behavior all serve to escalate the encounter unnecessarily. These small, documented overreaches illustrate the cumulative effect of authority acting outside its legal bounds. The auditor's strategy of standing firm, recording continuously, and requesting supervision transforms these vulnerabilities into teachable moments, highlighting the importance of informed assertion of rights in everyday encounters with law enforcement. The transcript also captures the broader implications of these interactions. Beyond the immediate encounter, repeated patterns of overreach, misinterpretation, and intimidation underscore systemic vulnerabilities in law enforcement. The transcript demonstrates that authority can escalate quickly when unchecked by knowledge, transparency, or oversight. By documenting these moments, the auditor provides both evidence and insight, illustrating how lawful resistance and procedural literacy function as critical mechanisms for accountability. The psychological mechanics of escalation remain central throughout this phase. Officers' perception of challenge triggers repeated threats, verbal insistence, and coercive posturing, while the auditor's calm and legal grounding serve as a stabilizing influence. Observers can see how authority interacts with perceived threat, ego, and institutional expectation, and how lawful assertion of rights interrupts patterns of coercion. The transcript documents these dynamics meticulously, creating a blueprint for understanding escalation in bodycam encounters and the protective value of informed citizen intervention. Finally, we illustrate the intersection of legal thresholds, procedural norms, and human behavior. The repeated threats for obstruction, the insistence on identification, and the invocation of supervisory oversight demonstrate how ordinary encounters can evolve into constitutional crises when authority is exercised without adherence to law. The auditor's behavior, combined with precise documentation, provides both a protective shield and an educational lens. Observers can study how calm, informed resistance, coupled with knowledge of rights and strategic engagement with oversight structures, mitigates risk, exposes overreach, and ensures that legal protections are respected. Through this section of the transcript, the audience gains a comprehensive view of escalation mechanics, legal boundaries, and institutional dynamics. Every repeated demand, every threat, and every assertion of authority provides insight into the interplay between discretion, procedural adherence, and constitutional rights. Demonstrates that escalation is rarely spontaneous. It is cumulative, systematic, and often predictable when authority encounters informed accountability. As the encounter moves into its final stages, the transcript provides a critical lens into the resolution phase of a high-stakes bodycam confrontation. At this point, both procedural tension and psychological dynamics have reached their peak, and the auditor's measured responses continue to contrast sharply with the officer's defensive posturing. We focuses on the intersection of accountability, legal recourse, and institutional reflection, illustrating how constitutional rights, procedural overreach, and citizen assertion converge in real time. It is in this phase that the long-term implications of the encounter become visible, both legally and culturally. The transcript demonstrates that the culmination of repeated procedural overreach is not merely a series of tense interactions, it is a potential legal liability with significant ramifications. The auditor's refusal to provide identification absent reasonable suspicion, the officer's threats of taser deployment, and repeated claims of obstruction collectively form a pattern of behavior that aligns closely with recognized civil rights violations. By referencing established legal doctrine, the transcript emphasizes that these are not hypothetical concerns. The Supreme Court and federal cases like Glick v. Sif and Turner v. Driver establish clear precedent. Filming public officials performing their duties is constitutionally protected and cannot in itself justify arrest or detention. The transcript meticulously connects these legal standards to the officer's actions, highlighting a textbook case of constitutional overreach. A particularly significant moment in this final phase is the auditor's insistence on supervisor involvement and acknowledgement of rights violations. The transcript records repeated calls for a sergeant and the officer's delayed compliance, which underscores a structural vulnerability in law enforcement hierarchies. Individual officers may feel empowered to act outside legal bounds until supervisory oversight intervenes. The repeated deflection and resistance to providing a sergeant demonstrate a reliance on perceived authority and highlight how accountability mechanisms can be circumvented in practice. This phase, therefore, serves as a study in both procedural failure and corrective potential, showing that timely and informed escalation to supervisory oversight is essential for protecting civil liberties. The transcript also documents a critical juncture in officer recognition of overreach. The auditor's calm and legally grounded approach elicits acknowledgements of procedural missteps and offers of apologies, albeit limited and mediated through agency structures. These admissions, recorded in real time, reveal a layered interplay between individual accountability and institutional culture. While officers may initially act defensively, the presence of objective documentation combined with procedural knowledge forces recognition of rights violations. Here, the transcript demonstrates how independent recording functions not only as evidence but also as a corrective tool, compelling institutional acknowledgement where informal or subjective oversight might fail. Psychological dynamics remain central to understanding the conclusion of the encounter. The transcript illustrates that officers' initial interpretation of lawful recording as defiance or obstruction is gradually replaced by recognition of procedural reality. This shift is facilitated by the auditor's calm persistence, legal literacy, and insistence on supervisory oversight. Each acknowledgement of overreach is a critical turning point, revealing how procedural knowledge and strategic behavior can transform potential confrontation into resolution. Observers can see that escalation is not a one-way trajectory. When managed with knowledge and patience, even highly charged encounters can reach a legally and psychologically stable conclusion. The transcript also highlights the broader implications of documentation and transparency. By capturing every verbal exchange, threat, and acknowledgement, the auditor creates a permanent record that enables both immediate intervention and long-term accountability. The transcript emphasizes that without such documentation, subjective recollections might dominate, allowing misinterpretations or rationalizations of authority to persist unchecked. This illustrates a critical lesson in civil rights protection. Independent observation and accurate recording are essential safeguards against systemic overreach, ensuring that both citizens and institutions operate within the bounds of law. Civil rights implications are made starkly clear in this portion of the transcript. The auditor's experience, threats of arrest, verbal intimidation, and repeated misapplication of procedural standards constitutes a potential violation of 42 U.S.C. Pavam 1983, which allows citizens to sue for deprivation of rights under color of law. The transcript situates these violations within a clear legal framework, connecting specific actions to potential remedies. Observers can see that the encounter is not merely an isolated conflict but part of a broader pattern of systemic vulnerability where procedural overreach, misinterpretation of rights, and reliance on perceived authority converge to create tangible legal risks for agencies and individual officers. The transcript also illustrates the role of public perception and the cultural impact of such encounters. By asserting constitutional rights calmly and strategically, the auditor models the potential for lawful resistance to misapplied authority. Each verbal insistence, repeated request for a sergeant, and calm explanation of legal context provides a roadmap for other citizens navigating similar situations. The transcript demonstrates that while procedural knowledge alone cannot prevent escalation, it provides critical leverage in demanding accountability and safeguarding rights. This underscores a central theme of modern bodycam encounters. Transparency and informed resistance are essential tools in the preservation of civil liberties. An essential component of this final phase is the acknowledgement of the auditor's legal preparedness and strategic approach. By invoking legal knowledge, citing case law, and maintaining calm under pressure, the auditor exposes the officer's misapplication of authority and procedural overreach. The transcript documents these interactions with precision, showing how informed assertion of rights can neutralize threats and compel acknowledgement. Observers can study these sequences as models of effective civil rights enforcement, demonstrating the intersection of law, psychology, and institutional accountability. The transcript further emphasizes the importance of proportionality in law enforcement responses. Throughout the encounter, officers escalate verbal threats and imply physical coercion in response to a fully lawful act, recording public officials in public. By the final stages, it becomes clear that these responses are not legally justified, but are instead reactions to perceived challenges to authority. The transcript captures this dynamic meticulously, illustrating the danger of authority untethered from law. It also highlights the potential for independent oversight, documentation, and legal knowledge to correct these imbalances, ensuring that proportionality is restored and constitutional rights are respected. Part 3 also highlights the intersection of systemic policy, individual behavior, and legal accountability. The transcript demonstrates that even when individual officers act outside legal bounds, agency structures, including supervisory intervention and acknowledgement of mistakes, can provide corrective mechanisms. These structures are essential in maintaining the balance between authority and accountability. The repeated calls for a sergeant, the eventual acknowledgement of procedural missteps, and the offers of apology illustrate how structural oversight, combined with citizen vigilance can enforce compliance with constitutional standards. Another critical aspect documented in the transcript is the role of transparency in fostering institutional learning. By recording the encounter and maintaining a clear account of officer behavior, the auditor provides a case study in procedural misapplication, escalation dynamics, and the practical limits of authority. The transcript emphasizes that transparency is not merely about individual rights, but also about institutional improvement. Agencies can analyze such encounters to identify patterns, refine training protocols, and prevent future overreach. Observers gain insight into how civil society mechanisms, legal recourse, independent documentation, and public scrutiny interact with law enforcement practices to produce accountability. The transcript also underscores the enduring psychological effects of such encounters on both parties. The auditor experiences repeated stresses, threats, and intimidation, all while maintaining composure. Officers, on the other hand, confront the challenge of authority being legally questioned and documented. This dynamic reveals a fundamental tension in law enforcement interactions, the clash between perceived authority and lawful resistance. The transcript provides a detailed mapping of these psychological pressures, offering observers a nuanced understanding of how procedural, legal, and emotional factors intersect in high-tension public interactions. We situate this encounter within the broader context of civil rights enforcement, institutional accountability, and the role of independent observation. The transcript illustrates that bodycam encounters are not isolated events. They are microcosms of systemic patterns, revealing vulnerabilities, strengths, and potential reforms. The auditor's calm, legally informed behavior transforms a potentially volatile confrontation into a documented case study in procedural misapplication, legal boundaries, and the protective value of constitutional knowledge. Every moment of escalation, threat, and eventual acknowledgement provides insight into the mechanics of authority, the importance of oversight, and the enduring necessity of independent documentation. The transcript concludes with acknowledgement of potential legal remedies, including civil rights lawsuits for deprivation of rights, emotional distress, and reputational harm. This outcome highlights the tangible stakes of procedural overreach and the critical role of documentation in pursuing accountability. The transcript demonstrates that the auditor's actions, standing lawfully, recording the interaction, insisting on supervision, and invoking legal standards, serve not only to protect individual rights, but also to illuminate systemic patterns that can inform future policy, training, and legal enforcement. Through this final section, the transcript offers a comprehensive study of escalation, resolution, and accountability in bodycam encounters. It shows how lawful assertion of rights combined with strategic use of oversight and persistent documentation can counteract misapplied authority, restore proportionality, and create a permanent record for legal and institutional review. Observers can trace every command, every threat, and every acknowledgement, gaining a detailed understanding of how authority, law, and citizen rights interact in real time. Demonstrates that while procedural overreach can be immediate and intimidating, informed, calm, and strategically persistent action transforms potential crisis into evidence-based accountability, providing both a practical guide and a broader lesson in constitutional protection. The transcript, when viewed in full, presents a layered narrative: a citizen exercising rights, officers responding with escalating authority, and the eventual intervention of structural oversight and legal acknowledgement. It illustrates the enduring tension between discretionary power and codified law, the fragility of procedural compliance in real-world interactions, and the protective value of informed citizenry. By preserving each detail, documenting each escalation, and situating the encounter within legal and institutional frameworks, the transcript provides an unparalleled window into the mechanics of authority, the psychology of escalation, and the practical applications of constitutional protections in the modern era.